Our scripture reading this morning is from John chapter 8, verses 12 to 20. Again, Jesus spoke to them, saying, I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will never walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. Then the Pharisees said to him, You are testifying on your own behalf. Your testimony is not valid. Jesus answered, Even if I testify on my own behalf, my testimony is valid because I know where I have come from and where I am going. But you do not know where I come from or where I am going. You judge by human standards. I judge no one. Yet even if I do judge, my judgment is valid, for it is not I alone who judge, but I and the Father who sent me. In your law it is written that the testimony of two witnesses is valid. I testify on my own behalf, and the Father who sent me testifies on my behalf. Then they said to him, Where is your Father? Jesus answered, You know neither me nor my Father. If you knew me, you would know my Father also. He spoke these words while he was teaching in the treasury of the temple, but no one arrested him because his hour had not yet come. The word of God for the people of God.
You know, we're in Lent, and it's a season of self-reflection. And for me, I've just been stirred with so many memories, even in this service. That song, Here I Am to Worship, I was just overwhelmed. One of the last and most memorable time, well, not the last time, but a memorable time of singing that song was in China with a bunch of Christian believers, and just remembering the universal nature of God's love. I was also really stirred as we were thinking about this passage today of where Jesus says, I am the light of the world, because of a memory I have when I was just making my first 3 or 4 days when I was living in Israel on sabbatical. You see, I'd arrived in October, and I didn't really know what was going on, except that I would go into the old city of Jerusalem, and everybody was walking around with little mini palm leaves, it seemed like to me, and I couldn't figure out why. And then I was noticing that in all the businesses or in the towns around Jerusalem, there would be like these little shacks being built outside of people's houses. And I was like, what's going on? This is obviously something really special. And I have to confess to you, even though I had been a pastor for dozens of years at this point, I've been a student of the Bible, I had no idea what was going on. But what was happening was the reenactment of a festival that's been going on for thousands of years in Judaism. And it's called the Feast of the Booths, or the Feast of Tabernacles. And while I had seen that in the Bible, I didn't really pay much attention. Who cares about all those things? But suddenly I was in Jerusalem, I was wondering, what was this all about? So it's interesting to know a little bit about this festival, because this is the context in which this story takes place. It says in John chapter 7, right before Jesus makes this declaration of being the light of the world, it says that the festival of booths, the festival of tabernacles, or as they say in Hebrew today, Sukkot, this festival was happening. And if you recall, if you want to open your Bibles to John 7 and see if I'm really telling you the truth, what happens is Jesus and his band were heading up to Galilee, but his brothers, it says, say, come on, Jesus, come with us. And he says, nah, I don't want to go to the festival. I'm not ready to reveal myself quite yet. So they all go on up ahead of him, and they go from Galilee to Jerusalem, and then Jesus shows up in the middle of this festival, and he begins to teach. And as what happens in all of this is that they get really upset with Jesus. And in fact, these are the moments when we start seeing in the text where the Jewish leadership starts talking about having Jesus arrested, having him killed. He was such a controversial figure. I've read this passage many times in my life. In fact, I've even preached on this same text of, I am the light of the world. And I realized that without sort of understanding this festival of Sukkot, the Feast of Tabernacles, the Festival of Booths, you can miss something really rich about what Jesus is actually saying about himself, the claim that he's making about who he is, if you don't understand a little bit about the context in which Jesus says this. So let's back up. What happened at this festival? You see, the Festival of Booths was meant to be a fall festival. It was after all the olives have been processed and all the fall produce and summer produces come in, and you would come to the ancient city of Jerusalem to give thanks to God for all the great blessings. It's a festival that even today goes on for over a week. People take off work and they engage in this time of remembering God's provision and faithfulness to them. But the story that's behind it is tied to the Exodus. because this is a story that celebrates the fact that while the ancient Jews were wandering around the desert, they would build for them little booths out of plant material, and that's what they protected themselves from the elements. In other words, the first set of Boy and Girl Scouts way back then would build their own little tents out of the materials that were available. And so they call it the Festival of the Booths, building this little teeny house, and even in faithful Jews in Jerusalem to this day will build this off the side of their house as a temporary shelter, and they sleep in it and they eat in it for 7 days, and then they invite family and friends. It's a very, very social festival to remember their wandering in the desert and that God was faithful to them. But the actual rituals themselves related to this festival on the Temple Mount were really fascinating. The priests every morning would leave the big Temple Mount, and if you think of modern-day Jerusalem, you probably are all aware of the Dome of the Rock, right? Which is where the Jewish shrine, or the Muslim shrine is. Well, that is like this, I don't know, it's like 10 football fields. It's that big on the top of this Mount Moriah in Jerusalem. And before there was the Dome of the Rock, in the first century, there was a big, giant temple built there. And this is where they offered all their sacrifices and all this kind of stuff for their religious rites as Jewish people, something Jesus was very familiar with and his people were familiar. So they would go out off the platform and go to the eastern side of this platform, and they would actually turn their backs as the sun was rising and say, our forefathers and mothers looked to the east for help. But they would stand and they recite this verse that says, as for us, we will look to the Lord. In other words, this is a festival that reorients you away from other resources, and the focus is on the provision and the protection of God. And also then every single day, this was what they would do right as the sun was coming up. But during the early morning hours, those people with those palm branches I was wandering around seeing, they were reenacting what their version of sort of like a palm waving event would be, what we might call Palm Sunday. And so below this Temple Mount, where the temple was a pool called the Pool of Siloam. And they would gather up water from this pool. It's considered sort of this rich source of water. In King David's time, it existed outside of the city walls, and it was this very spring that protected the city against all these sieges that would come in ancient Jewish history. So this pool has significance, and it's running. It's the place where Jesus heals the blind man who he puts mud on his eyes, right? It's in this area. And the priests would gather these big buckets of water, and they would walk all the way up to the Temple Mount, and on the way, the people would wave these palms. It was a huge celebration, and it would talk about this living water, the sustenance of God, who, remember, their journey in the wilderness was about God would break open the rock to give them water. They didn't have enough food that they could depend on without God's provision. They could never have enough water without God providing it, and they would reenact this ritual as they came up to the Temple Mount, and they would fill the basins and all these kinds of vessels around the temple for worship, celebrating the living water. It's this part of the festival that, if we had read a passage earlier, that's still part of the same story, that Jesus actually refers to himself as the living water. And he says, let anyone who is thirsty come to me, and they will never be thirsty. Out of a believer's heart shall flow these springs of living water. So what Jesus here, he's first stirring up controversy because he's saying he is like the God who has provided water in the wilderness. He's the one who can quench the thirst. And you can already imagine the murmuring that begins now, right? Jesus is likening himself to God and saying, I'm as powerful as this source of water that you celebrate and do your worship at this amazing festival. One was the story of the turning towards God in the morning. One is marching the water up to the temple every morning with a big parade of people standing around celebrating. And then the last piece of this festival was that every night they lit menorahs. And what they had 4 giant menorahs that were around the center part of this temple. These candelabras were over 75 feet tall. So think about that. Take this and double it, at least. Even more, like 5-story building. That's how tall these big candelabra lights would be. And they would put it in front of the temple And because the city is on a hill, you could see this light from everywhere, right? And they actually lit it. They would use the priest's old robes and they would turn those into wicks. And it would just be this big flame. It's like, think about the Olympic flame times about 50, right? You know, it was just this amazing festival. And around this, there were parties. They danced and there was music and there was this celebration of God's light. Because in the wilderness, how did God guide them? God guided them with a pillar of light. That was the symbol of divine presence, was the light in the darkness. And this festival of lights, the lighting of these big, huge, sort of, I don't know, almost rocket-like fire-looking things that were so magnificent, was a celebration of not only God's guidance in the wilderness, but a symbol of God's presence with them. So when Jesus, in the context of this festival, declares himself to be the light of the world, he is making a very dramatic claim. He is saying, I am the light. I am the divine presence. When people often debate whether or not Jesus actually makes claims to his divinity, it's verses like this, if you understand its context, that you can see how controversial what Jesus is saying. He is not only using this image that we talked about last week of I am language, which was the name of the divine presence revealed to Moses, but now he's appropriating these symbols, the living water and also the divine light, and saying, this is who I am. I am the light. I am the very presence of God. I am the one who will guide your way in the darkness. Well, I don't know about you, but I could use some of that light this week. Gosh, we're people of darkness, aren't we? 50, the count went up to 50 today of the worshipers in the mosque in New Zealand that were murdered so heinously. I mean, it's unbelievable what happened there. I mentioned earlier that we're doing this class on suicide. The internal darkness that our children and youth are struggling with, that deep, dark despair. There's darkness all around us. When I think about our country and its divisiveness and how divided we are, and then you just add to all of that all sorts of, racism, homophobia, ageism, classism, the issues of poverty in our country that are so tragic, and you realize there's just darkness. And as Barb and I were talking this week, she was reminding me that while hunger globally has been declining, they're now expecting an uptick in world hunger because of the amount of impact from conflict and climate change and poverty. Nearly 30% of all people in Africa are food insecure. We've talked about hunger in our area, but think about that. Think about that whole continent. Almost 30%, almost a third, somewhere, 27%, 28% of people are food insecure. There's darkness all around us. And I find myself reading this promise that Jesus is the light of the world, and I'm like, so where are you? I want to see some of that light somewhere. Because this week, I didn't want to open the newspaper. I didn't want to open my apps to see what was going on. I wanted no more bad news to come my way. Did you feel a little bit like that this week? I sure did. And while some of these tragedies touch us much more closely, when we're talking about kids in our community or the people who are food insecure here, it's easy to close our eyes to maybe what happens way over somewhere across oceans. And yet in this day and age, we're painfully aware of how connected we are. And as the Bible tells us, when one part of the body hurts, we hurt. When one part of the body weeps, we all weep. And when humanity is struggling, all of us bear that weight. So I found myself going back to my memory of Sukkot. What is it about this great festival that can remind us of something about Jesus' ability to speak into that darkness? As it says, to that we will not walk in darkness. It doesn't say we will never have darkness. How can these darkness just be stops on the journey instead of the staying place that we are stuck in? And I found myself thinking about those rituals I mentioned. I don't know if it was because of the devotion or because of the time in the chapel or whatever, but for the first time in a long time, I found myself lighting a candle this week, wherever I was. The candle in my living room, it's a very tall center candle I lit. For some reason, I would just sit in my living room and kind of look at that light. Even in my office, we have a light that we often light at session meetings, and it usually sits in my office unlit, but this week, I lit it. Maybe it was my way of connecting to this story of saying, I don't want to turn to the other sources. I want to turn my eyes as those ancient priests did and said, as for us, we will turn our eyes to you, O Lord. Perhaps the first thing of all of this darkness is around us is taking that first step of turning towards God. Remembering that in the midst of all this darkness, there is the hope of light that can emerge, but it comes in our ability to see it, perceive it, to know it, comes from first turning back towards God. But then I was reminded also of that ceremony where the living water is brought up from the pool of Siloam up to the temple. And I thought perhaps another way into this, dealing with all this darkness, looking for those places where there's life, where there is hope, where there is change, where things are good that are happening. Instead of only focusing on the darkness, are there places where it's life-giving? This week, as I've been thinking a lot about these suicides, I've been actually reminded of the story that's in my own family. Because my youngest daughter attempted suicide twice when she was in high school. And the story is very personal to me. I lived with tremendous fear watching her go through the rest of her high school years and then into college, and then afterwards as she struggles with issues of mental distress in her life. And oftentimes she would call me at her lowest, most desperate, most despairing points, because after all, those are the phone calls that mothers get, right? We get our kids unvarnished, uncensored when they really need a helping hand or a warm voice on the other end to assure them that somehow it's going to turn out okay. And for me, one of the things I often said to her as I would listen and always wondering if this was now my invitation to jump on a plane and get as fast as I could to see if I needed to save her life yet again. But often the conversation would go to, where is something in your life that brings you life? Where is something that you can do that can bring about joy? Where is a group of people who, when you're with them, somehow you know you're supported and loved? And when I could get her to think about just that one little place of living water in her life, so to speak, she could usually identify that and she'd say, oh yeah, I can do that. And whether it meant she went to the beach for the morning, whether she went to go see a group of friends, whether she drew or did some of her art or whatever it was often that place of where was it life-giving? That was the thing that just brought her up enough that then she could begin to navigate the mental distress she was feeling. Finding those places of the living water in our own lives can be a place for us to begin to not only see the darkness, but to see the places of hope. And then finally, this amazing lighting of these huge candelabras in worship. I've found in my own life that sometimes it's in these kinds of moments of worship that I simply ask the question, what is it that I can do? God, if I'm walking on this journey with you and I've only got enough illumination for the next step, what is it that you want me to concretely do? For those of us who cannot really affect our brothers and sisters in New Zealand, we can't access them very well. But we can join the Pope's declaration to pray for our Muslim brothers and sisters. We can stand against people who take and disparage people because of their religious convictions and faith without ever really understanding who they are and what they believe, where our points of partnership and contact can be. I know that this has been part of my journey as I've spent so much time in the Middle East. It's been a place of learning more, loving well, and being an advocate for those who are hurting. Even this class that I'm offering tonight related to these suicides in Forest Hills School District, which are so tragic, is in part trying to bring my own story to bear on the support that I can give to others who may be going through similar types of things. It's that one step. Our hunger ministries are our second and third and fourth steps often in being able to actually say, Christ has given us his light. We know how to live. We know what to do. We need to get on with it. We need to follow that light into the temple. Allow our lives to be that city placed on a hill, as it says in Matthew, to let our light shine. For after all, Jesus not only claims that he was the light of the world, he challenges us and tells us that we are his light in the world. And therefore, we act in his name. Jesus said, I am the light of the world. Those who follow me will never walk in darkness. Let us follow him with faithfulness and joy.